The thing about apex predators is they always think they're the smartest creature in the room. Take Gorth Maul, for instance, standing all 8 feet of scaled, clawed magnificence in the cargo bay of Hadron 6, his amber eyes gleaming with what he undoubtedly believed was tactical genius. The K'thuri Alpha had just made what would go down in galactic history as perhaps the most spectacularly backfiring decision since someone thought it was a good idea to poke a sleeping human with a stick. "The arrangement is simple," Gorth Maul rumbled, his voice carrying that particular blend of arrogance and condescension that only comes naturally to species who've spent millennia at the top of their respective food chains. "You will care for my cubs for 10 rotations. When I return, they will be properly prepared." Natalia, grease-stained coveralls, perpetually annoyed expression, and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades wrestling with stubborn machinery, looked down at the 2 small bundles of scales and attitude that had just been deposited at her feet like particularly exotic luggage. The cubs couldn't have been more than 3 cycles old, all oversized eyes and needle-sharp teeth, making those little chittering sounds that somehow managed to be both adorable and vaguely threatening. "Properly prepared for what, exactly?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was already regretting the question. Gorth Maul's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his kind. "Softened, weakened, made compliant through your species' pathological need to nurture." He practically spat the last word, as if the very concept of caring for young was somehow distasteful. "When I return, they will be grateful for proper K'thuri discipline. They will understand strength through contrast with your gentleness." Now, here's where things get delicious. Because what Gorth Maul had done, in his infinite wisdom, was essentially hand over 2 future apex predators to a species that had climbed to the top of their own food chain not through superior claws or fangs, but through sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness and an almost supernatural ability to turn any situation to their advantage. Humans, you see, don't just survive. They adapt, improve, and then teach everyone around them to do the same, usually while complaining about it the entire time. 10 rotations, Natalia repeated flatly, watching as one of the cubs, the slightly larger one, immediately began investigating the nearest piece of equipment with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was already planning to take it apart. "And you're paying me, what, exactly for this babysitting gig?" "Payment?" Gorth Maul's laugh was like grinding metal. "Human, you should consider this an honor. Few beings have the privilege of shaping future K'thuri warriors, even temporarily." The smaller cub had apparently decided that Natalia's boot was either a threat or a toy, and was now attempting to gnaw through the reinforced leather with admirable persistence. She looked down at him, then back up at the towering alien who was clearly expecting her to be impressed by his generosity. "Right," she said, in the tone of someone who had dealt with more than her fair share of entitled customers. "And when these future warriors eat through my station's life support systems or decide to hunt the maintenance bots for sport, I'm supposed to just, what, send you the repair bill?" This was, of course, the exact moment when Gorth Maul should have realized he was dealing with someone who had clearly thought this through more than he had. Instead, he simply waved a dismissive claw. "Minor inconveniences. Your species excels at managing such details." The way he said it made it clear he considered this a character flaw rather than a strength. "The cubs will be contained, fed, and kept alive. Nothing more is required." Natalia bent down and carefully extracted her boot from the smaller cub's jaws, noting the impressive dent marks he'd already managed to leave in the supposedly bite-proof material. The little guy looked up at her with those enormous amber eyes, made a sound that was half purr and half growl, and then promptly tried to bite her hand instead. "Contained," she repeated, dodging a surprisingly quick swipe of tiny claws. "Right, because that's definitely how this is going to work." The larger cub had apparently grown bored with the equipment and was now studying Natalia with an intensity that was frankly unnerving in something so small. There was intelligence there, the kind of sharp, calculating awareness that suggested he was already filing away information about this strange new environment and the peculiar creature that inhabited it. They are called Nex and Axon, Gorthmal continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that one of his offspring was now attempting to scale Natalia's leg like a particularly determined tree. Nex is the elder, Axon his clutch brother. They will require protein-rich sustenance and adequate space for physical development. Beyond that, he shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both dismissal and disdain. Your methods are irrelevant so long as they survive. What Gorthmal failed to mention, and what would prove to be rather important later, was that Keth-Uri cubs bond with remarkable speed and permanence to whoever provides consistent care during their formative cycles. He also neglected to explain that they possess an almost supernatural ability to learn and adapt, particularly when exposed to new concepts and technologies. But then, why would he? In his mind, he was simply parking his children with a convenient caretaker while he attended to more important matters. Survival, Natalia muttered, finally succeeding in detaching Axon from her leg only to find that Nex had somehow managed to activate one of her diagnostic scanners and was now examining the readout with obvious fascination. Yeah, that's definitely going to be the easy part. Gorthmal turned to leave, his massive frame casting shadows across the cargo bay. 10 rotations, human. When I return, have them ready for proper education. And with that, he was gone, his ship disappearing into the black with a kind of casual confidence that suggested he'd just solved a minor logistical problem rather than fundamentally altered the future balance of power in the galaxy. Natalia stood alone in her cargo bay, watching as Nex figured out how to adjust the scanner's sensitivity settings, while Axon discovered that the emergency klaxon made an interesting sound when poked repeatedly. The noise was already giving her a headache, and she'd been responsible for these two for all of about 10 minutes. Well, she said to the empty air, this should be interesting. Because here's the thing about humans that Gorthmal had completely failed to grasp. They don't just care for things, they improve them. Give a human a broken machine, and they'll fix it better than it was before. Give them a problem, and they'll solve it in ways nobody saw coming. Give them 2 alien cubs to babysit for a decade, and, well, that's where things get really entertaining. As Nex looked up from the scanner with an expression that clearly said, "Can we take this apart and see how it works?" While Axon continued his systematic exploration of every potentially dangerous object within reach, Natalia realized she was going to need a drink, possibly several. But first, she supposed, she'd better figure out what Keth-Uri cubs actually ate, whether her quarters could be adapted to accommodate growing predators, and how exactly one goes about explaining to 2 highly intelligent alien children that their father had essentially abandoned them with a stranger because he thought it would make them weaker. This was going to be a very long 10 rotations, though something told her they were going to be far more interesting than Gorthmal had bargained for. 3 cycles in, and Natalia had learned several important facts about Keth-Uri cubs that apparently nobody had bothered to mention in the cultural exchange manuals. First, they grew fast, disturbingly fast. What had been knee-high bundles of scales and attitude were now approaching her shoulder height and showing an alarming tendency to test the structural integrity of everything they encountered. Second, they were smart. Not just can-learn tricks smart, but figured out how to reprogram the food dispensers to deliver twice the usual portions. Smart. Which explained why her supply requisitions had been flagged by Station Command 3 times this month. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they absorbed information like particularly aggressive sponges. Everything Natalia did, said, or even muttered under her breath while fixing yet another piece of equipment they'd accidentally dismantled was cataloged, analyzed, and somehow incorporated into their rapidly expanding understanding of how the universe worked. "No, Nex," she said without looking up from the fusion coupling he'd somehow managed to reverse engineer overnight. "You cannot improve the station's defense grid by routing it through the coffee maker. I don't care if your calculations suggest it would increase efficiency by 12%. The larger cub, now nearly 5 feet tall and possessed of disturbingly human-like hand-eye coordination, made that huffing sound that had replaced his earlier chittering. It was, Natalia had learned, roughly equivalent to a teenager's exasperated sigh. But the current configuration is inefficient, Next protested, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of his species' natural harmonics and an accent that was becoming increasingly, well, human. The coffee maker's heating element could serve dual purpose. More logical. The coffee maker, Natalia replied with the patience of someone who'd had this exact conversation about 6 different pieces of equipment this week, is the only thing standing between me and homicidal caffeine withdrawal. Touch it, and I'll use you for spare parts. From across the workshop came the sound of something expensive being creatively disassembled. Natalia closed her eyes and counted to 10 in 3 different languages before calling out, "Axon! What are you doing?" "Learning," came the cheerful response, followed immediately by a sound that definitely shouldn't be coming from any piece of technology designed to remain in one piece. Natalia found him surrounded by the components of what had once been a perfectly functional, atmospheric processor, each piece laid out with the kind of methodical precision that would have made a forensic investigator weep with joy. Axon looked up at her with an expression of such genuine enthusiasm that she couldn't quite bring herself to be angry. "I think I can make it better," he announced, gesturing at what appeared to be a complete redesign sketched out on her workbench. "See, if we reroute the intake manifold through a secondary filtration chamber and add a feedback loop here." The thing was, his modifications actually made sense. More than sense. They were brilliant. The kind of innovations that engineering teams spent months developing, and he'd worked them out in an afternoon just by taking something apart and thinking about how it could work better. This was becoming a pattern. Both cubs had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to understand, improve, and then completely reimagine any technology they encountered. But it wasn't just mechanical aptitude. They absorbed concepts, philosophies, and ways of thinking with the same voracious appetite they showed for their daily protein rations. "Natalia," Nex said, appearing at her shoulder with that unnerving silence that all Kethuri seemed to master by adolescence. "Why did our father leave us here?" And there it was. The question she'd been dreading for 3 cycles, asked with a kind of straightforward directness that made evasion impossible. She looked down at him, though not as far down as she used to, and saw intelligence, curiosity, and something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like hurt. "Because," she said carefully, "he thought I would make you weak." Nex's head tilted in that bird-like gesture she'd learned meant he was processing information. Weak how? Soft, compliant, easy to control. She gestured around the workshop, taking in the evidence of their various improvements. He figured human influence would make you less traditionally Kethuri. "Ah," Axon said, looking up from his atmospheric processor project. So he was stupid. The casual dismissal in his tone would have been shocking coming from any Kethuri cub addressing their alpha father. Among their species, filial respect wasn't just expected. It was biologically hardwired. Except, apparently, when that biology got mixed with human concepts like earning respect and proving your worth through actions rather than genetics. Not stupid, Natalia corrected, though privately she was starting to think Axon had a point. Just limited in his perspective. Limited, Nex repeated, testing the word. Yes, he saw weakness where there was adaptation, softness where there was flexibility. His amber eyes focused on her with laser intensity. "You have taught us that strength comes in many forms." Which was true, though she hadn't exactly planned it as a formal curriculum. It had started with simple necessity. 2 growing predators needed structure, challenges, and outlets for their natural aggression that didn't involve destroying her station or eating the maintenance staff. But somewhere along the way, it had become something else entirely. She'd taught them engineering because they were curious about how things worked. She'd shown them tactical thinking because they needed to understand consequences. She'd explained human history because they'd asked why she approached problems differently than their father would have. And somehow, without really meaning to, she'd raised them not as Kethuri cubs or human children, but as something entirely new. "The supply ship is late again," Axon observed, apparently having exhausted the educational potential of the atmospheric processor. "Third time this month." "Pirates," Natalia said automatically. "Same group that's been hitting the outer stations. Command thinks they'll move on eventually." Both cubs went very still, and Natalia suddenly remembered that Kethuri didn't have the same philosophical objections to violence that humans pretended to maintain. Their stillness wasn't fear. It was focus. The kind of predatory attention that suggested something was about to become prey. "These pirates," Nex said carefully, "they are preventing supply deliveries to civilian stations. Among other things. Yeah. And the station commanders are waiting for them to leave?" "Pretty much the official policy, yes." The look the two cubs exchanged was the kind of wordless communication that happened between siblings who'd spent cycles learning to think in parallel. It was also, Natalia realized with growing alarm, the look of two highly intelligent predators who'd just identified a problem they wanted to solve. "Hypothetically," Axon said, in the tone of someone asking a completely innocent question, "if someone were to address this pirate situation more directly, what would be the appropriate response from Station Command?" "Hypothetically," Natalia replied, "they'd probably want to pin medals on whoever solved their problem for them." Why? But they were already moving. That synchronized purpose that had replaced their earlier random destructiveness. Within hours, her workshop had been transformed into something that looked suspiciously like a tactical planning center, complete with star charts, shipping schedules, and detailed analysis of the pirates' operational patterns. "They're predictable," Nex announced, pointing to a series of markers on the chart. "Same routes, same timing, same methods. They rely on surprise and superior firepower. But they don't expect coordinated resistance," Axon added, his claws tracing possible intercept courses. "Especially not from a mining station." "And what exactly are you planning to do about it?" Natalia asked, though she suspected she already knew. The smile Nex gave her was all teeth and completely human in its mischievous confidence. "We're going to hunt." Which was how, 6 days later, Natalia found herself watching two teenage Kethuri systematically dismantle a pirate fleet using tactics that would have made Sun Tzu weep with pride, and technology that shouldn't have existed for another decade. They'd taken her mining drones, weaponized her sensor arrays, and somehow convinced 3 other station commanders to coordinate what amounted to the most elegant ambush she'd ever witnessed. The pirates never knew what hit them. One moment they were moving in for another easy raid. The next they were surrounded by what appeared to be angry mining equipment that had somehow learned to fight back. The few survivors who made it to escape pods were babbling about demon machines and impossible technology. "Well," Natalia said, watching the cubs methodically salvage useful components from the disabled pirate ships, "that was educational." "We learned much," Nex agreed, directing a salvage drone with the kind of casual expertise that suggested he'd been doing this for cycles rather than days. "Human tactical philosophy is flexible. More flexible than Kethuri approaches," Axon added, hauling what looked like an entire weapons array toward their makeshift workshop. "Father would have charged directly at the largest ship, and probably won," Natalia pointed out. "Yes," Nex said. "But then the others would have escaped to raid elsewhere. This way, the problem is solved entirely." It was, she realized, a fundamentally different approach to conflict. Not just defeating an enemy, but eliminating the entire problem they represented. Thorough, methodical, and absolutely ruthless in its efficiency. Word of the Hadron Station incident spread through the shipping lanes like wildfire. Within weeks, Natalia was fielding requests from other stations, mining operations, and even some of the smaller colonies. Could the new defense protocols be adapted to their situations? Would the station's security consultants consider taking on additional clients? The Cubs, of course, were delighted by the attention. More problems meant more opportunities to learn, adapt, and improve their methods. Each new challenge became a case study in applied human ingenuity, combined with Cathuri instincts. But it wasn't just tactical thinking they were absorbing. They'd internalized human concepts of fairness, merit-based leadership, and the revolutionary idea that being born to power meant nothing if you couldn't prove you deserved it. They spoke of earning loyalty and building consensus. With the same casual familiarity that other Cathuri discussed dominance hierarchies and territorial rights. "You know," Natalia said one evening, watching them coordinate a supply run that had somehow evolved into a minor diplomatic mission, "your father is going to be very surprised when he comes back." "Yes," Nex agreed, not looking up from the communication array he was modifying. "We are looking forward to that conversation." The tone in his voice suggested that conversation might be something of an understatement. Because somewhere in the process of learning human adaptability and Cathuri determination, the Cubs had developed something their father had never expected, ambition that extended far beyond simple survival. They weren't just planning to survive his return, they were planning to be ready for it. 8 cycles later, Gorthmal would have needed a fleet admiral and 3 intelligence analysts just to begin comprehending what his weakened Cubs had accomplished. What had started as a mining station with an unusual approach to pirate problems had somehow evolved into the administrative center of something the Galactic news feeds were calling the Nexus Coalition, a rapidly expanding alliance that seemed to specialize in solving everyone else's impossible problems. "Honestly," Natalia said, reviewing the latest membership applications while sipping coffee from a mug that had somehow become the unofficial symbol of coalition leadership, "I'm not even sure how this happened." She was now officially the elder advisor to an organization that controlled 15 star systems and maintained diplomatic relations with 43 different species. Her workshop had been replaced by a command center that would have made most planetary governments jealous, and her 2 former charges had somehow become the most influential beings in 3 sectors. Nex, now standing nearly 8 feet tall and possessed of the kind of quiet authority that made seasoned military commanders defer to his judgment, looked up from the holographic display where he was coordinating relief efforts for a plague-stricken colony. "We identified problems. We solved them. Others requested similar assistance. And you just kept saying yes?" "Efficient problems require efficient solutions," Axon added from across the room, where he was apparently redesigning the entire coalition fleet's propulsion systems during what most people would consider a coffee break. Each solved problem created new opportunities for optimization, which was, Natalia had learned, how the Cubs thought about everything. They didn't see expansion or conquest. They saw inefficiencies that needed correcting. A trade dispute here, a resource shortage there, a territorial conflict that could be resolved through creative redistribution of assets. Each solution created grateful allies, and grateful allies became coalition members. The beautiful irony was that they'd built their empire using techniques that would have horrified traditional Cathuri leadership. Instead of dominance through strength, they offered partnership through mutual benefit. Instead of demanding tribute, they provided services. Instead of ruling through fear, they led through competence. "The Cathuri High Command has been asking questions," Calneth reported, her scarred features displaying the kind of professional concern that came from decades of military intelligence work. She'd been one of their first non-human recruits, a disgraced Cathuri officer who'd been court-martialed for suggesting that maybe there were better ways to handle insurgencies than simply burning everything. "What kind of questions?" Nex asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "The kind that indicate they've finally noticed that their abandoned Cubs are now commanding a fleet larger than theirs." Calneth's mandibles clicked in what passed for dark amusement among her species. "Gorthmal, specifically, has been making inquiries about coalition leadership structure. Axon looked up from his propulsion calculations with an expression that somehow managed to be both innocent and predatory. "How delightful! We should invite him for a visit." "Should we?" Natalia asked, though she was already grinning. "Oh yes," Nex said, and his smile was pure human mischief wrapped in Kethuri confidence. "After all, it's been nearly 10 cycles. Time for a family reunion." The message that reached Gorthmal's command ship was brief, polite, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. "Father, the cubs you left have grown. We invite you to witness our development. Coordinates attached. Your sons, Nex and Axon, Supreme Coordinators of the Nexus Coalition." Supreme Coordinators. Of a coalition that, according to his intelligence reports, now controlled more territory than the Kethuri Empire had managed to acquire in 3 centuries of conquest. Gorthmal stared at the transmission until his tactical officer cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, your orders?" What could he say? That he'd accidentally created the galaxy's newest superpower by leaving 2 cubs with a maintenance engineer? That his brilliant plan to weaken his offspring had apparently backfired so spectacularly that they now commanded resources that made his own fleet look like a patrol squadron? "Prepare the fleet," he growled. "We investigate." The coordinates led to what his sensors initially registered as a heavily fortified star system with defensive capabilities that frankly shouldn't have existed. As they approached, Gorthmal found himself staring at installations that combined Kethuri engineering principles with technologies he didn't recognize, all arranged in patterns that suggested someone had taken traditional military doctrine and improved it beyond recognition. "Incoming transmission," his communications officer announced, sounding slightly stunned. "They're requesting permission to escort us to the station." "Escort?" Gorthmal's voice carried the kind of dangerous quiet that usually preceded violence. What appeared on his main screen was his son, Nex, but not as he'd left him. This was a fully grown Kethuri male in his prime. But something was different. The way he held himself, the confidence in his bearing, the casual authority that radiated from every gesture. This wasn't the submissive compliance Gorthmal had expected from a decade of human influence. "Father," Nex said, and his tone was perfectly respectful and completely terrifying. "Welcome to Coalition Space. We have much to discuss." The escort turned out to be a fleet formation that demonstrated tactical principles Gorthmal had never seen before. Ships moved in coordinated patterns that maximized both defensive capability and firepower projection, while maintaining formations that could adapt instantly to changing conditions. It was like watching a military doctrine that had evolved beyond traditional concepts of fleet warfare. "How many ships?" he asked his tactical officer. "Unknown, sir. The sensor readings are unusual. They appear to be using some kind of adaptive camouflage technology that makes accurate counts impossible, which meant they could have any number of ships out there, all invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. It was the kind of technological advantage that turned fleet actions into foregone conclusions. The station itself was even more impressive. What had once been a simple mining facility had become something that looked like a cross between a military command center and a diplomatic embassy, surrounded by defensive installations that hummed with barely contained energy. But it was the beings moving through its corridors that truly caught Gorthmal's attention. Dozens of species, all working together with the kind of seamless coordination that usually took decades to develop. And they all deferred to his sons with a kind of genuine respect that couldn't be faked or forced. "The cubs you abandoned," Natalia said by way of greeting, and Gorthmal found himself facing the human he dismissed as a mere caretaker 9 cycles ago, have become rather impressive adults. She was older, grayer, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd helped shape the galaxy's newest power. Behind her stood his sons, and Gorthmal finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. They weren't weakened, they weren't compliant. They were apex predators who'd learned to think like humans, and the combination was absolutely devastating. "Father," Axon said, stepping forward with a tablet that displayed what appeared to be comprehensive intelligence reports on every Kethuri military installation. We've been analyzing traditional Kethuri tactical doctrine. It's remarkably inefficient. Inefficient, Gorthmal repeated, the word tasting like ashes. Brutal, yes. Intimidating, certainly, but ultimately limited by its reliance on fear rather than loyalty. Next gestured to the beings around them. We've discovered that beings who choose to follow you are far more effective than those who follow because they must. The offer, when it came, was delivered with the kind of casual confidence that made it clear refusing wasn't really an option. Join us, Nex said simply. The Kethuri Empire can become part of something larger, more efficient, more successful, or it can continue its current trajectory toward irrelevance. The choice, Gorthmal realized, had already been made. His own people were looking at his sons with the kind of admiration he'd spent his life trying to earn through force. They saw strength, intelligence, and vision that promised a future beyond simple conquest. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Axon's smile was pure human humor, wrapped in Kethuri certainty. "Then you'll discover just how thoroughly your weak cubs learned their lessons." Within a month, the Kethuri Empire had voted to join the coalition. Gorthmal found himself holding a ceremonial position in an organization run by the sons he'd tried to weaken, who ruled through the very human principles he'd hoped to purge from their characters. "You planned this," he said to Natalia during the integration ceremony. "Planned?" She laughed, raising her coffee mug in a toast. "I just taught them to think. Everything else was their idea." And that, Gorthmal realized, was the most terrifying thing of all.